This video is not an essay, it is a raw nerve. Contagion is a 2011 film directed by Steven Soderbergh, starring an ensemble cast including Marion Cotillard, Matt Damon, Lawrence Fishburne, Jude Law, Gwyneth Paltrow, and Kate Winslet. The film revolves around the origin, contraction, spread, and cure of the fictional MEV-1 virus, a highly contagious, aggressive, and fatal strain of hybrid bat and pig flu. The initial patient, Beth Emhoff, played by Gwyneth Paltrow, contracts the virus in Macau after shaking hands with a casino chef who has recently handled an infected pig. She spreads the virus to several other people in the casino after they handle objects that she's touched, such as gambling chips, a martini glass, and her cell phone. An important aspect of the film is that the fictional virus is highly transmissible via fomites, which are objects that an infected person has touched after touching their mouth or nose, coughing or sneezing on the object, or otherwise leaving infectious residue on an otherwise inert, non-biological object. A local waiter who handled her glass returns home, infecting members of his family before wandering into traffic in a fever-induced delirium where he is struck by a vehicle and killed. A Japanese businessman who shared chips with her returns to Tokyo where he falls ill rapidly, dying suddenly of a seizure on a crowded bus, infecting several bystanders who touch him or handrails that he touched. A Ukrainian model who handled Beth's phone flies to London where her symptoms also escalate rapidly while she transmits the disease to others via handling portfolios and riding in a cab. Beth returns to America where she infects several people in Chicago, first her ex-lover John, who contracts it when they have sex while she is on layover, and a bartender at the airport who handles her credit card, before flying to Minneapolis where she infects the coworker who drives her home from the airport and her son Clark. A day or two later, Beth's husband Mitch, played by Matt Damon, picks up Clark from school after Clark begins to exhibit a fever. While Beth and Mitch are talking in the kitchen, Beth suddenly has a seizure. Mitch rushes her to the hospital, leaving Clark with a babysitter, but Beth's condition continues to worsen. She fails to respond to treatment, and she dies. As a stunned Mitch is driving home, he gets a call from the babysitter that Clark has possibly had a seizure and might not be breathing. Mitch tells her to call 911 immediately, but before anyone can get there, Clark is already dead. From there, the story expands to encompass the doctors, politicians, reporters, hucksters, and ordinary people who are swept up in an all-encompassing pandemic that threatens to kill a quarter of the global population. The movie is an incredibly tense 100 minutes of society pushed to its breaking points, not as a fantastical disintegration into wastelands of leather-clad murder gangs or a zombie apocalypse, but one rooted in the historical reality of epidemics. And I can't stop watching it. I've watched Contagion over 15 times in the last few weeks. Several days I've just watched it on repeat 2 or 3 times. And I'm not alone. According to Netflix, it is at the time of writing the second most watched thing in Canada. For weeks, it has sat in the top 10. Unlike many similar films such as the 1995 film Outbreak starring Dustin Hoffman, the film is not about any one person and there is no singular twist of victory. Rather, it is an example of sociological storytelling. It is about the systems and networks that these characters exist within and how they both influence and are influenced by those systems, and what happens when those systems are placed under tremendous strain. Kate Winslet plays Dr. Erin Mears, a frontline worker for the CDC who is sent to Wisconsin to track the transmission of the virus and contain its spread. Halfway through the film, she catches the virus herself, and then her condition worsens, and then she dies. It is unceremonious, it is not foreshadowed or paid off because it is not poetic, because pandemics are not poetic and don't have a tight arc or an eye for narrative fulfillment. It doesn't have meaning. The only meaning is in how we choose to respond. Because this is sociological, the movie doesn't end when Dr. Ali Hextall develops a vaccine. What would be the singular victory moment in most films is instead the beginning of a slow, painful march back to stability, as first the vaccine needs to be mass-produced and then distributed to billions of people worldwide. It is a dangerous task that needs to be tightly controlled as it requires access to the isolated virus and thus is very slow to ramp up. The film trudges through the immense societal tension that is created when there is a cure, but it will take over a year to make and distribute enough for everyone, a situation that lays bare every societal privilege. Dr. Orontis, played by Marion Cotillard, is kidnapped and held ransom for the vaccine by Chinese villagers who are keenly aware that in the priority of global politics, the poor, the rural, and the non-white are at the very back of the line. They are terrorists, but they are not wrong, just desperate. They are at the back of the line, and the government throws them under the bus anyway. Despite the existence of a vaccine, Mitch continues to keep his teenage daughter Jory under aggressive quarantine out of legitimate fear of the disease that has been amplified to paranoia by the trauma of losing Beth and Clark, the survivor's guilt of being naturally immune, and the uncertainty of whether his daughter would share that immunity or not. In December 2019, the coronavirus COVID-19 was identified by doctors in the city of Wuhan. Over the course of January and February, the spread of the virus began to be identified in South Korea, Japan, and Italy, and gradually most of the rest of the world. The disease itself is not exceptionally lethal when compared to epidemics such as the Black Death in the mid-14th century or the spread of smallpox through indigenous populations following contact with Europeans in the 16th and 17th century, but well, first of all, better than the Black Death is a pretty bad standard, and second, on a global scale, a mortality rate of 1 to 2% in an unchecked pandemic still means, in absolute terms, millions and millions of preventable deaths. This is compounded by the strain that mass illness, even one that is not terribly lethal, inherently places on an already strained society. Crowding healthcare systems, disrupting infrastructure, and forcing people to choose between working while ill and thus infecting others or losing their jobs. A low mortality rate is often the result of adequate care, but the quality of care goes down as the number of severely ill goes up. As the number of infected healthcare workers reduces the number of people qualified and capable of administering that care. This, in turn, has a knock-on effect where unrelated illnesses and injuries become more dangerous. A heart attack or broken leg that would be easily managed under normal circumstances becomes that much worse when there aren't enough people to help, aren't enough beds to go around. The more people who are exposed, the more need to roll the dice against that 1 to 2%, and the more are going to lose. As of March 2020, most of the United States and Canada have entered a period of uncertain quarantining. Non-essential businesses are closed, events are canceled, workers are being sent home or laid off, borders are being shut down, and the economy is in freefall. Every existing societal problem, from income equality to housing to healthcare, is being stressed and amplified by not only the virus, but the complicity of our governments. News comes out hourly about warnings the people in charge received months ago and the ways in which they were either ignored or exploited for personal gain. Several American politicians were briefed on the security risks of COVID-19 in late January and then took to Twitter to decry public fear as a partisan hoax while they dumped their stocks in preparation for a crash that they knew was coming. People in government, their corporate donors, and their pundit allies are getting anxious, debating breaking quarantine and telling everyone to go back to work and roll the dice on whether or not they're going to die for the economy. We are standing on the precipice of a very uncertain future, and we don't know if that future is days, weeks, months, or years away. This could be the new normal for a very long time. So why do I keep watching Contagion? A dimension of narrative that I like to bring up pretty regularly is the idea that one purpose of fiction is that it allows us a space to practice intense emotions and states without exposing us to the complexities or harms of those states in reality. This is typically in the context of the fanciful, reckless stunts, wild sex, gunfights, or general risky behavior. We talked about this with 50 Shades and the idea of non-consent as a fantasy subject. Watching a disaster film in a disaster, particularly one as sociologically driven as Contagion, is an extension of this. Rather than practicing intense emotional states before they happen, this instinct of exposing ourselves to what we're already experiencing, amplifying existing emotional states, it works as a form of emotional inoculation. I am scared and anxious and uncertain, and so I will make myself more scared and more anxious and more uncertain because it's still fiction. It's still safe. It still has an end. It is bounded. Things will get bad. Things will then get worse. People will die. The world is unfair. It is unbalanced. It is unjust. And catastrophe will bring out both the best and worst of all of us. And then it will end. Is there looting and arson and murder? Yeah, but it is ultimately out of the ordinary. People get paranoid, people get desperate, they riot under stress, but even when food supply lines break down, the world isn't summarily turned over to those with the bullets and the willingness to use them. There is no Mad Max dystopia, no Fallout post-apocalypse, because at the end of the day, humans are pro-social. The cooperative survive. In 1349, in the midst of the Black Death, it must have looked like the end of the world. Entire households, entire villages dying a gross, horrifying, painful death, month after month after month. Then, for generations, every year wondering if this was the year that plague returned. Was this the year that there would be no one left to bury the dead? But people survived. The working class, who bore the brunt of the disease and saw the bodies of their families, clans, and communities piled like cordwood, fought back against the aristocrats who isolated themselves in their towers and remote estates. It was messy and bloody, and it took decades, but in the end, serfdom was abolished. Europe lost upwards of 60% of its population over the course of 5 years, but it wasn't Armageddon. Things kept going. People kept going, and Europe would go on to be absolute bastards to the rest of the world. The disease in Contagion is not unrealistic. Real diseases have been as deadly or worse, but it is dramatic. It moves very, very quickly, is highly contagious, and kills a huge number of those who are infected. In reality, this aggressiveness would kind of work against the disease and morbidly would help responders limit the spread. It moves so fast and kills so quickly that there's little question of who has it, and within a couple days, everyone who has it is either recovered or dead. This was the aspect of the SARS epidemic that allowed response teams to effectively quarantine the virus where it burnt itself out. That said, it's not impossible that something could spread so aggressively, be so incredibly contagious, that it could spread like wildfire and become almost impossible to contain before anyone even knows what's going on. But it's undeniably dramatic and emotionally effective. 48 hours. We can contain 2 days in our head, a situation where things will get materially worse literally tomorrow or the day after if nothing is done right this second. That's a comprehensible timeline. 48 hours is short enough that in a catastrophe driven by adrenaline and stress and necessity, you can stay awake that long without even realizing it. COVID's life cycle is closer to a month. By the time you get sick, you've already been sick for 2 weeks, and now you're in for hell for another 2 to 4 weeks. It's just past the range where it really feels real. 2 weeks isn't long, but it's still over the line into the indeterminate future. This problem extends in both directions. There's only so much space in the mind for time. As the news ramps up, as things get worse, the present crowds out history. The distance between the irrelevant past and the now contracts. Days ago becomes distant. Months ago is irrelevant. Years ago is ancient. By evening, even earlier the same day, is suspect in its relevance to the now. We remember January, but it has as much presence in the mind as childhood. Our lives become superliminal, displaced from time, as we wrestle with our own minds and how they try to process the chronology of our own existence. By Sunday, Friday no longer feels real, and yet every day's news is the consequence of decisions made 14, 21, 28 days ago. Today's responses won't yield results until well into next month. This flaw in our meat is a gap into which charlatans, hucksters, and conmen can drive a wedge and pry us open, and pry they will try. When I first saw Contagion in 2012, I thought the weakest element was what I considered at the time to be a demonization of online media. Jude Law's character plays an online pundit and conspiracy theorist who preaches to an audience of millions about an herbal tincture of forsythia that he claims is the cure, a cure he just so happens to be selling. It is, in 2020, the realest element of the film. Herbal cures, hydrogen water, steam treatment, teas, magnets, suspensions of silver, tinctures, and tonics. We've got pastors standing at the pulpit telling their congregation it's all a hoax, that there's no reason to suspend services, that their nebulous enemies are just trying to shut them down. We now live in a world where the US president told people based on a rumor that chloroquine, a drug used for treating malaria and lupus, was the cure, so a man in Arizona ate a packet of fish tank cleaner containing the chemical. He's dead now. And that is, again, all part of it. There is an escapism to a story about horrible things because that story is complete. It is bounded. It provides a framework to horror that doesn't exist in the real present. Our future is uncertain, beset on all sides by devils, and we can come out better or we can come out worse, or we can die and none of us knows which it will be, and we're all screaming at those in power to make the moral choice, to choose better. and I am in an absolute haze. My daily life has not much been impacted overtly. I'm already an agoraphobic shut-in who works online and has a bad sleep schedule, but it's too much. I'm tired all the time. I can't pay attention to the news, and I can't not pay attention to the news. Working is difficult. I have a long history of respiratory illness. I am at risk. On one hand, I am deeply privileged to be in a position where I am and can remain isolated. On the other hand, I can't even think about the other hand. Disease does not have a narrative meaning. It does not have an eye for poetry or twists or closure. The only meaning is in how we respond. So I watch Contagion over and over and over again because I need to practice emotions, and I need to live in a bounded world, and I need to believe we can choose better.